Hi guys. Tonight we begin by stepping into the narrow gaslit streets of Victorian London. The air is thick with coal smoke and the damp chill of an autumn evening, and you can almost hear the distant rhythmic cough from an open window, the anxious murmur of conversation over a garden wall. It's the kind of scene that looks picturesque in a faded photograph or a period drama. But if you had to actually live here, especially when illness slipped into your home, you would understand before the first night passed that your biggest adversary wasn't poverty or hard work. It was the fever. The simple, terrifying reality is this. For most people, medicine was a fragile web of guesswork, folk wisdom, and desperate hope. And if you or your child fell seriously ill without access to a modern doctor, pharmacy, or hospital, you'd discover quickly that survival was less about science and more about grim endurance. You probably won't survive this. At least, not without navigating a hidden world of risky remedies and impossible choices. So before you get settled, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely find value in exploring these hidden layers of the past. And as you're listening right now, feel free to drop your current location and local time in the comments below. It's always fascinating to see where in the world these stories are being heard, and to remember that not so long ago, the night felt darker, and a quiet room could hold a lifetime of fear. The morning arrives not with light but with a thickness. London, East, 1873. Autumn does not bring crisp air here. It brings a broth of chimney smoke and river damp and the particular chill that seeps through brick. You wake to it already in your lungs, a familiar grit on the tongue. The room holds the night's closeness, the shared breath of 4 bodies in one space. You rise quietly, your feet finding the cold floorboards by memory. The fire in the grate is a memory too, just grey ash and a single stubborn ember winking like a tired eye. You kneel, blowing gently, coaxing life back into yesterday's fuel. This is the first ritual, the one that makes all others possible. As the first weak flame licks at a splinter of wood, you hear the sound, not a cry, a whimper. Thin and dry from the corner where the children sleep. You turn. Emily is already awake. She's 7. She's not sitting up to watch you light the fire as she usually does. She's lying perfectly still, her head turned toward the wall. You call her name softly. She does not answer. You cross the room, the boards creaking under your weight. You place the back of your hand against her forehead. The skin there is not warm. It is hot. A dry, papery heat that seems to glow from beneath. You let your hand rest for a long moment, calibrating. Your own skin is cool from the morning air. The contrast is stark, undeniable. You slide your hand down to her cheek. It is flushed with a colour that is all wrong, a deep, unsettling rose that stands out against the pallor of the sheet. Fever, blush. You know it without having a word for it. Emily, you say again. Can you sit up, love? She shakes her head, a tiny movement against the pillow. Her eyes open briefly, glassy and too bright, then close. You touch her throat, feeling the pulse jump rapid and bird-like under your fingers. Your own heart begins a different, heavier rhythm. Not yet panic, not yet. It is the first quiet click of a lock turning. You lean closer. The smell hits you then, cutting through the room's usual tapestry of odours. Beneath the ever-present coal smoke, beneath the lingering scent of last night's boiled cabbage and the dank wool of blankets, something new. A sweet, faintly metallic scent. It clings to her skin, to her hair. It is the smell of a body fighting something invisible. You straighten up, your hands falling to your apron. The questions begin their silent parade. Is it just a chill? She was playing in the yard yesterday, the air was damp. But the flush is too deep. Is it a simple fever? Children get fevers, but this heat, this smell, is it the start of something? One of the somethings. The words you do not say, even in your mind, hang in the air. Scarlet fever, typhus, the smallpox. No, not that, please not that. You decide to wait. This is always the first decision. To watch. You pull the thin blanket higher over her small shoulders and turn back to the fire. The flame has caught now. eating into the wood with a soft, crackling appetite. You feel the kettle from the water pail, the metal dipper clinking. The ordinary sounds are suddenly loud, deliberate. You make tea, the strong, cheap leaves steeping into a dark brew. You slice bread. The routine is a rope you hold on to. Your husband, Thomas, stirs in the other narrow bed, rolling over with a groan. The day must begin. The other child, John, who is 12, sits up rubbing his eyes. He sees you looking at Emily, sees your face. He understands without being told. A shadow passes behind his own eyes. He dresses quickly, silently. The house is awake now, but a different kind of awake. It holds its breath. Thomas eats his bread standing by the fire, drinking his tea in quick hot gulps. He glances at the small form in the bed. "Just a chill," he says, his voice a rough hope. "Keep her warm." You nod. You say nothing of the smell. He picks up his tool bag, gives John a nod. The door closes behind them, and you are alone with the silence and the quick, light breathing from the corner. The silence does not last. The house is not a sealed box. Sound leaks in and out. You're at the wash tub, scrubbing a shirt against the board, the soapy water splashing your wrists. The rhythm is mindless, mechanical. Then you hear it. The low murmur of voices from the narrow yard behind the houses. You cannot see them, but you know the scene. Mrs. O'Brien from number 5 and Mrs. Davies from number 7 taking in yesterday's washing, which never truly dried in the damp air. Their words are not clear, but the tone is. It is the low, serious hum of diagnosis. You catch a phrase. "All over him, poor lamb, spots like freckles." Another voice answers, sympathetic and fearful. "Not the scarlet, was it?" A pause. The doctor called it a rash. Took 2 shillings to call it that. This is how news travels here. Not in newspapers, but over grey linen and faded cotton, passed between hands that are raw from lye soap. Disease has a social life of its own. It is discussed in codes and categories that have nothing to do with medical books. You know the lexicon. A bad cold is a cough that lingers. The fever is anything that brings high heat and delirium. Nervous trouble is the catch-all for the pains and weariness of women. A weakness in the chest is what took your own father, a polite term for the consumption that hollowed him out. Children have their own taxonomy. The croup with its barking cough, the whoop that steals a child's breath, the measles which is common and the scarlet which is feared, and above all, the pox. The word is rarely spoken aloud. It hangs in the air like the smoke, a final, unspeakable verdict. You wring out the shirt, your hands tight and strong. You understand the hierarchy of dread. At the bottom, the simple chill, the upset stomach. Then the childhood ailments, expected yet perilous. Then the fevers that could go either way. Then the great plagues, the scarlet, the typhus. And at the pinnacle, smallpox, the great disfigurer, the great killer. It is a map of anxiety every mother carries in her heart. You listen to the women's voices fade as they go back inside. A door closes. The yard is quiet again, save for the drip of water from a leaking pipe. You go to the window, a small square of grimy glass. You look out not to see, but to be seen. Your eyes scan the windows of the houses opposite. You are looking for signs, a curtain drawn fully shut in the daytime, a rag stuffed into a broken pane, a pot of something, perhaps thyme or rue, placed prominently on a sill. In other, wealthier streets, illness might be a private matter. Here it is a communal fact. A house of sickness is a node of danger, but also of duty. Neighbours will know. They will ask, indirectly. They will leave a small loaf or a bit of broth by the door if they can spare it. They will also calculate risk. They will tell their children not to play too close. The geography of friendship shifts subtly, dictated by the invisible landscape of contagion. You do not draw your own curtain. Not yet. It is too soon. To draw it is to make a declaration, to admit the thing inside has weight and name. For now, you simply stand there, your hand on the cool glass. The world outside continues. A costermonger's cart rumbles down the street. the donkey's hooves clacking on the stones. A boy runs by, shouting something lost to the wind. Life, ordinary and relentless. It feels distant, like a play you are no longer part of. Your world has already shrunk to this room, to the rhythm of a little girl's breath, to the dry heat under your hand, to the sweet, sickly scent that now you realise you can smell even from here, mingling with the smoke and the damp wool, making a new and terrible perfume of home. You turn from the window, the cold touch of the glass lingering on your fingertips. The ordinary sounds from the street now feel like an intrusion, a noise from another world. Your world has condensed to the few feet of space around Emily's bed. The waiting has begun, but it is not an idle wait. It is a watchful, active vigil, guided by a knowledge that lives in your hands and your memory, not in any book. You pull the single wooden chair closer to the pallet and sit, your back straight, your eyes missing nothing. You lean forward. "Emily," you whisper, "open your mouth for me, sweetheart." Her eyelids flutter, but she obeys, parting her lips slightly. You peer inside. The tongue is what your own mother taught you to read first. A healthy tongue is pink and clean. Emily's is coated with a thick, whitish fur, like mildew on bread. You note the colour, the texture. It speaks of heat trapped inside, of the body's humours gone awry. You remember your grandmother's voice, rough and sure, as she examined a cousin 50 years ago. A white coat is a common fever, a yellow coat, trouble in the liver, a brown or black coat. She would cross herself. You see only white. You take this as a small, fragile mercy. Next you must see the water. You lift the chamber pot from beneath the bed, its cold china weight familiar in your hands. The liquid within is a dark, troubled amber. You hold it up to the weak light from the window, turning it slowly. You look for cloudiness, for strange sediments settling like silt at the bottom. Your grandmother spoke of reading the urine as a wise woman reads tea leaves. Thread-like clouds could mean gravel in the kidneys. A reddish tint was a warning of bad blood. You see only the deep colour of concentrated waste, a sign she is not drinking, but no ominous streaks or specks. You set the pot down quietly, another data point in your silent assessment. Your hands now go to the buttons of her nightdress. Your fingers work slowly, carefully. You need to see the skin. Fever rashes have their own maps, and a mother learns to read them. Measles begins behind the ears, a sprinkling of red that spreads downward. Scarlet fever paints the chest and neck a furious red, rough as sandpaper to the touch. You pull the fabric aside, your eyes scanning the pale, hot skin of her chest and throat. You run your fingers lightly over it, feeling for the raised bumps of a rash. There is only smooth, fevered skin. You check her back, her tiny wrists behind her knees. No spots, no telltale patterns. This too you log away in the ledger of your worry. No rash is good. But a fever this high with no outward sign feels strangely deceptive, as if the illness is hiding deep within, which in some ways seems more sinister. On the shelf above the fireplace, next to the tin of tea and the stub of a candle, sits a book. Its spine is cracked, its corners softened from use. It is not a Bible. It is a home medical guide purchased by Thomas's father in a fit of aspiration years ago. The title, in faded gold letters, promises domestic health and the family physician. You've taken it down perhaps 3 times in your life. You do so now, the weight of it solemn in your hands. You open it carefully, the pages releasing a smell of old paper and dust. The text is dense, the words long and Latin tinted. You find the section on juvenile fevers. It speaks of miasmas and humoral imbalances, of purgatives and cooling diets. The advice feels both grand and utterly useless. It suggests a regimen of light broths, rest, and the application of leeches if the pulse is too strong. It does not tell you how to distinguish one fever from another in a child who cannot describe the pain behind her eyes. It does not tell you what to do when a leech costs more than a day's food. The book is an artifact of authority, but its authority lives in a different, cleaner, wealthier world. You close it gently. Its primary use, you realise, is not in its prescriptions, but in the faint sense of structure it provides, the illusion that someone, somewhere, has written down an answer. You return to the chair. The fire pops, a sharp, comforting sound. Your hands lie folded in your lap, but your mind is not still. Prayer begins not as a deliberate act, but as a current running beneath your thoughts. The words of the morning prayer you uttered hours ago come back to you, but altered. You had asked for strength for the day's labours. Now, the plea shifts shape silently inside you. You ask for guidance. You ask for this cup to pass. You do not say the words aloud, but they form in the quiet centre of you, addressed to a God you imagine as a distant, stern overseer, one who might be petitioned through perfect conduct and relentless endurance. Your faith is not a blazing thing. It is a tool for bearing weight. Sickness is a test, a trial. It is also sometimes a punishment, though you scour your conscience and find no recent sin great enough to warrant this. The uncertainty feeds the quiet dread. You promise silently to be more patient, to complain less, to give an extra penny to the ragged man on the corner, if only this passes quickly. The morning stretches into afternoon. You have made your diagnosis with the tools you have. It is a fever of unknown origin. It is significant, but not yet catastrophic. You have consulted the inherited wisdom and the printed authority. You have sent your petition heavenward. Now comes the hardest part. The decision. You will wait. This is the strategy of the poor, the first and most fundamental line of defence. To call for help costs. To move a child to hospital is unthinkable until every other hope is gone. The body, you've been taught, has a wisdom of its own. Often, given rest and warmth, it will right itself. To intervene too quickly with harsh purges or costly doctors might weaken its natural resolve. This is what you tell yourself as you watch the shallow rise and fall of her blanket. So you settle into the watch. You will give it this day and this night. You rise and wet a cloth in the cool water from the pail, wringing it out. You place it on Emily's forehead. She murmurs, a sound of faint relief. You'll change this cloth every half hour. You'll try to spoon sips of water mixed with a little sugar between her lips. You'll keep the fire steady, maintaining an even, enveloping warmth. You'll watch the colour of her face, the rhythm of her breath, the state of her sleep. You will do all this with a focused, quiet intensity. This is your work now. The washing can wait. The mending can wait. The entire machinery of the household slows to this one essential function: observation and palliative care. You are the nurse, the diagnostician, the sentry. The day becomes a long, slow exhalation, measured not by the clock on the mantel, which stopped working last winter, but by the intervals between changing the cloth, by the slight variations in her breath, by the slow crawl of light across the floorboards. You are waiting for a sign, for the fever to break or for it to declare its terrible name. And as you wait, the room itself seems to lean in, holding its breath with you. The afternoon light, weak and granular with suspended dust and smoke, slants through the window and falls across the floor in a long, pale rectangle. It does not reach Emily's corner. You have positioned her bed carefully, away from the direct draught of the window, but also not too close to the hearth. The fire's heat must be a gentle embrace, not a suffocating blanket. A kettle steams quietly on the hob, adding a thread of moisture to the dry, fevered air. This space around her pallet is no longer just a corner of the room. It has become a theatre of care, and you are its stage manager, its sole practitioner. Your first duty is to take inventory. You rise from the chair, your knees stiff, and move to the wooden cupboard fastened to the wall. It's not a proper cabinet, just a simple box with a small door, but it holds your arsenal. You open it. The smell that wafts out is complex, a library of ailments. There is the sharp, clean punch of camphor, a small lump of it wrapped in muslin. Next to it, a twist of paper containing dried peppermint leaves, their scent faded but still holding a ghost of coolness. From a nail on the inside of the door hangs a bunch of elderflowers, gathered last summer, their tiny white blooms now grey and brittle but still believed to coax sweat and break a fever. These are the herbs, the old knowledge, the gifts of hedge and field. Beside them, the substances from a newer, less trusted world. A brown glass bottle, half full of a viscous liquid. Label written in your own careful hand reads Mag. Sulph. Epsom salts. Purgative bought from the chemist for a penny when Thomas's back seized up last winter. It sits with a quiet, potent threat. And then, the most guarded item, a smaller, darker bottle with a cork stopper tied down with string. Laudanum. The label is a chemist's printed one, the letters ornate and official. You touch the bottle but do not lift it. It is for true agony, for the cough that will not stop, for the pain that threatens to unravel the mind. It is a last resort, for its comfort is a treacherous, sleepy trap. You close your fingers around a tin instead, smooth and cool. Opening it releases a pungent, mustardy smell that prickles your nose. The mustard plaster, a paste of powder and flour ready to be mixed with water and spread on cloth. A brutal bringer of heat, a counter-irritant meant to draw the inflammation to the surface. On a lower shelf sit the tools of application, neatly folded linen strips torn from an old sheet and washed to softness. A small stone jar of goose grease, the fat rendered last autumn solid and pearly white. It is for chapped skin, for chest rubs. Next to it, a pot of honey, dark and thick, last season's harvest from a keeper in the countryside, traded for a morning's mending. It is for soothing a raw throat, for sweetening bitter teas, for its supposed power to heal. And then, the more severe instruments, kept out of sight but not out of mind. The enema syringe, with its bulb of hardened rubber, lies wrapped in a cloth. It is a violation you hope to avoid. The lancet, a simple sharp blade, rests in a wooden case. It is for letting blood, a practice your own mother swore by but that fills you with a cold dread. The leech jar, a clear glass bell, is empty. You would have to send to the chemist for them, and that is an admission of a crisis you're not ready to make. These objects are not just things, they're possibilities, paths towards relief or toward deeper suffering. Their very presence dictates the boundaries of your hope. You select a few items, the elderflowers, the linen, the goose grease, the mustard tin. You close the cupboard door. The act of choosing focuses you. You bring the kettle to a gentle boil and sprinkle a handful of the crumbled elderflowers into a chipped bowl, pouring hot water over them. A fragrant, herbaceous steam rises, joining the room's existing tapestry of smells. It must compete with the soot from the chimney, the damp wool of the blankets, the faint, sweet, sour odour of illness that still clings to Emily, and the ever-present underlying scent of the building itself. Old wood, mildewing plaster, and cold, wet earth. The steam from the bowl adds a new, hopeful note to this heavy air, a small declaration that you are fighting back with the weapons you have. You pull the chair closer again, arranging your supplies on the floor beside you. The space is ready. Now begins the physical liturgy of care. You dip a corner of a linen strip into the warm elderflower infusion, wring it out lightly. You start with her face, wiping her brow, her hot cheeks, her neck. The water must be warm, not cold. A shock of cold could send the fever deeper into her body, or so it is believed. You must clean the sweat without chilling the skin. It is a balancing act performed with the utmost tenderness. You move the cloth gently, revealing the delicate skin beneath, pale where the fever flush recedes for a moment. Her eyelids flutter but do not open. Next, you prepare the mustard plaster. You mix a spoonful of the yellow powder with a little flour and lukewarm water in a saucer, stirring it into a smooth, pungent paste. You spread this evenly onto a square of linen. Your hands know the drill. You've done this for Thomas's chest colds. But on a child's skin it feels like a betrayal. You fold the edges of the cloth to make a packet and, lifting her nightdress, place it on her chest. You watch her face. For a few minutes there is nothing. Then a faint frown creases her brow. A small, restless movement. The heat is penetrating, a fierce drawing sensation meant to pull the congestion from her lungs, to stir the blood. You know it will redden the skin beneath, may even blister it if left too long. You check the clock in your mind, beginning the count. 10 minutes, 15 at most. The relief it might bring must be weighed against the burn it will certainly cause. This is the constant calculus of home medicine, the trade of one hurt for another, hopefully lesser, one. Feeding is its own quiet battle. You've prepared a thin broth from the bone of Sunday's mutton, watered down and strained until it is nearly clear. You lift her head gently, cradling it in the crook of your arm. Her body is limp, heavy with resistance. You bring a spoonful to her lips. Emily, you coax. A sip for me. Her lips part slightly. You trickle the liquid in. She swallows, a faint convulsive movement. Some of it dribbles down her chin. You wipe it away with the cloth. Another spoonful. This time she turns her head away. A weak but definite refusal. You persist, patient and relentless. You try a spoonful of milk and water sweetened with a drop of the precious honey. This she accepts a little more readily. You think of the small beer in the jug, a staple for all ages, believed to be safer than water and to give strength. But its slight bitterness might revolt her now. You stick to the broth and the milky water, spoonful by slow spoonful, until she will take no more. It is less about nourishment at this moment than about the simple, stubborn act of putting something benign into a body besieged by something unknown. As evening bleeds into night, the household reconvenes around the silent fact of the illness. Thomas returns, his face grimed with printer's ink and fatigue. He stands at the foot of the pallet, looking down at his daughter, his large, work-roughened hands hanging uselessly at his sides. He asks no questions. Your face tells him the watch continues. He eats his supper, a bowl of potato soup standing by the fire, his eyes never leaving the small form in the corner. Your son John finishes his chores with a subdued air, fetching more water, banking the fire for the night. He's watching, learning. The night shift must be arranged. The room holds only the 2 beds. Emily is in one. You will need to be near her. Thomas cannot sleep beside the sick child. He must work in the morning, and the restlessness would ruin him. You nod to the narrow, ladder-like stairs leading to the loft space under the roof. He understands, takes his blanket and climbs up, the stairs groaning under his weight. The loft is icy in autumn, filled with stale air and stored useless things. It is an exile he accepts without complaint. You turn to John. He's 12, tall for his age, his childhood softness hardening into the angular lines of a young man. His eyes meet yours. "I can sit with her," he says, his voice careful, trying on a duty too large for his years. You shake your head. "You must sleep," you tell him. "But you can take the first watch. I'll need your help later." This grants him dignity and shares the burden without breaking him. You make up a place for him on the floor near the fire, with a blanket and a sack stuffed with straw. You'll take the chair by Emily's bed. He sits there now, in the chair you have vacated, very straight, his hands on his knees, watching his sister breathe. You move about, tidying, preparing. You mix a fresh bowl of lukewarm water. You check the mustard plaster, removing it just as the skin beneath begins to glow an angry pink. You smooth a little goose grease over the heat, a gesture of apology. You build up the fire so it will burn slow and steady through the night. The room settles into a new rhythm, defined not by the clock, but by the intervals of care and the sharing of watchfulness. You look at your son, a sentinel in the flickering light, and at your daughter, adrift in a sea of fever. The house has transformed. Its walls are no longer just shelter. They are the boundaries of a small, fragile infirmary, and you are its entire staff, its weary, hopeful heart. The quiet of the sick room in the gathering dusk was a fragile thing, and it was broken not by a knock, but by a soft, familiar scraping at the door. You looked up from wringing out a cloth. John, drowsing in his chair by the fire, started awake. You knew the sound. It was the shuffle of worn slippers on the stone step, the pause of someone listening before intruding. You crossed the room and opened the door a crack. Mrs. Martha Harris from 2 doors down stood there, a wiry woman of 60 whose face was a roadmap of hard years. She did not smile. Her eyes, sharp and dark, went past you into the dim room, seeking the small bed in the corner. She held a bundle in her apron, clutched to her chest. "I heard," she said simply. Her voice was a dry rustle. "Heard young Emily was poorly." You opened the door wider, a silent invitation. She stepped in, her movements economical, and the room seemed to shrink slightly with her presence. She brought in the smell of the hallway, of other cooking, of her own particular scent of lavender and mothballs. She did not approach the bed immediately. That would be presumptuous. Instead, she stood just inside the doorway, her gaze taking in the scene. The carefully banked fire, the bowl of water, the folded linen strips, your own tired face. It was an audit of crisis. "I brought a bit of this," she said, unfolding her apron. She held out a few knobby, dirt-brown roots, their surfaces wrinkled and woody. Licorice. Not the sweet sticks from the fair, but the raw root. "My sister's boy had a terrible cough last winter," she continued, her voice dropping into the confidential tone reserved for the exchange of medical intelligence. Couldn't draw a clean breath. Chewed on a piece of this, slow-like, and it loosened the grip in his chest. She placed the roots on the small table near the door, next to the unused medical book. They looked like nothing, like bits of old tree. Their power lay entirely in the story that accompanied them. She stayed for 10 minutes, a formal visit of solidarity. She asked no prying questions about symptoms, but offered anecdotes instead. She spoke of a fever that broke after a poultice of grated onion and bacon fat. She mentioned the Miller child who'd had spots that came and went, turned out to be nothing but a reaction to cheap soap. Each story was a data point, a fragment of experience added to the collective ledger of survival. She was not offering certainty, she was offering context. Her visit said, "You're not alone in this. Others have passed this way. See, here are the marks they left." When she left, the licorice root remained on the table, a tangible token of the neighbourhood network, a thread connecting your private worry to the wider, unspoken web of communal endurance.
After she left, the silence felt different, less isolated. You returned to your chair. The evening deepened, and with it came the sounds of the street settling into its nocturnal character. The clatter of carts diminished, replaced by footsteps, distant shouts, the occasional bark of a dog. Then, cutting through it all, a new sound reached you, a high, melodic cry, practiced and piercing. It was the herbalist's boy, making his final round. His voice rode the cold air, a sovereign remedy for all aches and pains, a balm for the troubled breast, the true and only gypsy's elixir, sure to drive out ague, fever, and the melancholy humours. The words were a rhythmic chant, full of extravagant promise. You did not move from your chair, but you listened. You knew the boy knew the thin, watery bottle of brown liquid he would produce from his pack. It was mostly alcohol and treacle, flavoured with a bitter herb to taste medicinal. It was the cure minus all sold from the back of a painted wagon at the market. The wonder water hawked on corners, its very name, elixir, spoke of alchemy and magic, a fantasy of a simple answer. It offered hope in a bottle. You had bought it once, years ago, for a headache that wouldn't quit. It had burned going down and left you drowsy. The headache had remained. You knew its worth, yet the cadence of the call was a siren song, especially now in the helpless watches of the night. It spoke to the part of you that desperately wanted a single, clear action to take. You looked at the licorice root, plain and mute, and then listened to the glorious promises fading down the street. The distance between them was the distance between inherited wisdom and desperate commerce. Later, when Thomas came down from the loft before dawn to ready himself for the print works, he brought a different kind of knowledge into the room. He moved quietly, his face puffy from a short, cold sleep. He stood by the fire, pulling on his boots, and spoke in a low rumble not meant to wake Emily. "Old Finn at the press," he said, staring into the low flames. "HES from somewhere up in the hills originally." You looked up, your hands pausing in folding a blanket. "Wet socks?" "Aye, wool socks dipped in cold water and wrung out, put right on the feet. He says it draws the heat down and out. Sounds daft to me, but he swore by it. Said it saved his brother when he was a lad." He nodded slowly. It was a piece of law from a geography you would never see, a practice born of a different landscape, offered freely across the workbench. This was the other network the diaspora of rural knowledge carried into the city by men like Finn. They brought with them the ghosts of country remedies, the use of certain mosses, the timing of treatments by the moon, the faith in the drawing power of the extremities. Thomas reported it not with belief, but with the solemn respect of one passing along intelligence. He did not suggest you try it. He simply laid it on the table of options, another potential tool in the scant arsenal. After he left, the image lingered in your mind cold, but wool on snow-hot feet. It seemed both cruel and oddly plausible. You filed it away with Mrs. Harris licorice and the memory of the elixir's empty promise. As the first grey light began to dilute the blackness outside the window, your vigil reached its deepest, most solitary hour. John was asleep on his pallet, his breath even. The house was a vessel of breathing, the slow, ragged pull from the bed, the steady rhythm from the floor, your own weary sighs. Your body ached for sleep, but your mind was exposed nerve. It was in this hollowed, minus-out silence that your hand went to the book on the shelf, not the medical guide, but the other one, the family Bible, its black cover worn soft at the edges. You did not open it to read broadly. The effort was too great. Your fingers knew where to go, finding the place through practice and worn pages. The Psalms. You turned the pages slowly, the thin paper whispering in the quiet. You found the one you sought, the words you had heard at countless bedsides, at funerals and moments of fear. Your lips did not move, but your eyes traced the familiar lines in the dim light. "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, evil, evil. For thou art with me, thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me." The words did not feel triumphant. They felt stark. They acknowledged the valley, the shadow. They did not promise a swift exit, only a presence. You read them again and again. The repetition was not about understanding, it was about rhythm, about anchoring your spinning thoughts to something ancient and solid. It was an incantation against the formless dread. You were not asking for a miracle. You were asking for the strength to sit through the next hour, for the fever to break, for your hands to remain steady. The book was a tool, as material as the linen cloth or the mustard tin. Its comfort was in its weight on your lap, in the tactile proof of tradition, in the simple repetitive action of tracing the words that generations before you had traced in their own dark hours. You closed it finally, your palm resting on the cool cover. The room was still the same. Emily still burned. The silent recitation had woven a thin thread of order through the chaos, a scaffold for your exhaustion to lean against. The knowledge network was not just out there, in the streets and the workshops. It was also here in this worn book, in the echoes of old prayers, in the quiets, stubborn act of seeking a pattern in the darkness, any pattern to hold onto until the dawn. The second night passed in a long, seamless corridor of unease. You did not sleep, not in any way that brought rest. You existed in a state of suspended animation, hovering between the chair and the bed, your consciousness tethered to the sound of Emily's breathing. The elderflower steam had scented the air to no avail. The lukewarm sponging seemed to do little more than redistribute the heat on her skin. The mustard plaster had left an angry red patch on her chest, a testament to effort, not improvement. By the time the weak grey light of a new morning seeped into the room, the fever had not broken. It had settled in, a stubborn, glowing presence. Her sleep had grown fitful, punctuated by soft, meaningless murmurs. The waiting strategy, the first and fundamental article of faith in home care, was beginning to feel like a form of surrender. A new, colder fear whispered that you were watching something unfold that you had no power to redirect. The knowledge network of neighbors and folk wisdom had offered sympathy and anecdotes, but no key. It was time to cross a threshold, to step from the private world of home remedies into the semi-public, commercial realm of aid. It was time to go to the chemist. You waited until Thomas had left for the works, until John had been sent to school with a quiet word to say nothing. You wrapped Emily in her blanket, her body alarmingly light and limp in your arms, and carried her next door to Mrs. Harris. The old woman took her without a word, settling the child by her in half with a nod that said, "Go, do what you must." The trust was implicit, a transaction of desperation. You smoothed your apron, patted your hair. This was not a social call. You took the few coins from the cracked teacup on the mantel, the emergency fund, meager and sacred, and slipped them into your pocket. Their weight felt insufficient. The chemist's shop was 3 streets over, in a slightly better row where the buildings had proper shop fronts. The bell above the door announced you with a sharp, cheery jingle that felt like an affront. Inside, the air was thick, still, and profoundly strange. It was a cathedral of odors, each one layered and potent. The sweet, dusty smell of dried herbs hung in the air like a cloud chamomile, peppermint, horehound. Beneath it ran a sharper, more astringent thread, the tang of acids, the chalky dust of powdered minerals, the faint, metallic whisper of tinctures. And undergirding it all was the cloying sweetness of syrup, of boiled sugar and flavorings, trying to mask the bitterness of the drugs it carried. The shop was long and narrow, dim despite the gas jets burning low on the walls. Counters of dark wood ran along each side, behind which rose shelves crammed with jars and bottles of every size. Some held lurid like ulled liquids, emerald greens, ruby reds, deep ambers. Others contained cloudy white suspensions or dull brown powders. Labels were written in a neat, cryptic hand. The place was quiet, hushed. A few other customers browsed silently, their faces drawn with private concerns. You approached the counter, your heart beating a nervous rhythm against your ribs. The chemist himself emerged from a curtained doorway at the back. He was a man in his 50s, dressed in a dark suit slightly dusty at the shoulders, with a clean white apron tied over it. He wore spectacles, which he peered over as he looked at you. His expression was not unkind, but it was detached, professional. It was the look of a man assessing a problem presented for solution. "Good morning," he said. His voice was calm, measured. "Good morning, sir. My daughter. She has a fever. A high fever. It began yesterday." He nodded slowly, placing his fingertips together on the counter. "A rash? Any spots?" "No, sir. No rash. Her skin is clean. But she is very hot. She will not eat. She sleeps, but it is not a good sleep. A cough. Sickness of the stomach. No cough. No sickness. Just the heat. And she is listless." You realized you were describing an absence, a negative space. You were telling him what the illness was not, because you could not name what it was. He listened, his head tilted. He was not a doctor. He would not diagnose. He was a dispenser of responses to described symptoms. The consultation was a dance of inference. You offered clues, he offered potential counteragents. A persistent fever. He mused more to himself than to you, often a sign of systemic imbalance. The humors require calming. A cooling draft may be indicated. or perhaps a stimulant to rally the natural vitality. He turned slightly, his eyes scanning the shelves behind him. The performance was part of the service. He was demonstrating consideration, expertise. He reached for a bottle, a modest minus-sized one of clear glass holding an amber liquid. Camphorated tincture. A reliable February refuge. Gentle enough for a child if diluted. 2 drops in a teaspoon of water, 3 times daily. It will promote perspiration and cool the blood. You nodded, your eyes fixed on the bottle. It looked official, scientific. He placed it on the counter. Then his gaze swept over you, taking in your worn shawl, your mended gloves. His manner shifted almost imperceptibly from consultant to salesman. Of course, he continued, his voice dropping to a more confidential tone, the Constitution must be supported while the fever is fought. He reached for a larger, more ornate bottle. He reached for a larger, more ornate bottle. The label elaborate with scroll work and a printed picture of a robust, smiling child. Mrs. Winfield's soothing syrup infant tonic, for building strength and ensuring restful recuperation. A spoonful with each dose of the tincture would provide essential nourishment and soothe the nerves. You looked from the plain amber bottle to the magnificent blue one. You knew their relative positions in the hierarchy of cost. The camphor tincture you could perhaps afford. The tonic with its fancy bottle and glorious promises was an artifact from a different world. Your fingers tightened around the coins in your pocket. You felt the divide not just between the medicines, but between the people who bought them without thought and those who had to calculate the cost against a week's worth of bread. The chemist stood at this divide, a gatekeeper. He offered both science and solace, but only one was essential. The other was a luxury, a beautiful, sugary dream of easy recovery. "Just the tincture, please, sir," you said, your voice quiet but firm. He did not press. He simply nodded, the consultant's mask slipping back into place. He wrapped the small bottle in a scrap of thin paper, took your coins, and gave you a few pence in change. The transaction was complete. You had purchased a measured amount of hope, a chemical gesture. As you left, the bell jingling again behind you, you clutched the small parcel. The tonic remained on its shelf, a blue cleanable comfort. You had consulted an authority and made a compromise. The frontier between home and professional care had been crossed, and you found it was not a clean line, but a murky zone of partial knowledge, economic reality, and the quiet, desperate hope that a few drops of something from a bottle might tip the balance. The small amber bottle of camphor tincture sat on the mantel for a full day and night, a silent monument to your foray into the world of professional aid. You administered it with religious precision, 2 drops in a teaspoon of water, 3 times a day. You watched for any change, any slight dimming of the fever's relentless glare. Instead, the heat seemed to deepen, to become more entrenched. Emily's sleep deteriorated into a state of restless muttering, her limbs twitching under the blankets. The licorice root and the memory of wet socks were now artifacts from a more hopeful time. The chemist's potion had failed. The realization was a cold stone in your stomach. The next threshold loomed, higher and more daunting. The doctor. The decision was not yours alone. You waited for Thomas to return from the works that evening. You did not need to speak. The set of your face, the defeated slope of your shoulders as you spooned watery porridge into a bowl, told him everything. He ate in silence, his eyes on the far wall. Finally, he pushed the empty bowl away and looked at you. "We must send for him, then." It was not a question. You nodded, the motion heavy with the weight of the cost. A week's wages at least, and more for whatever medicines he would inevitably prescribe. The calculation was brutal, immediate. It meant debt. It meant a tightening of the belt that was already cinched to its last notch. But the alternative was unthinkable. The coin was counted out, a small, cold pile on the table. It looked like freedom and Drew and all at once. In the morning you gave John the task. You pressed a penny into his hand for the messenger boy and a slip of paper with the doctor's address, a street you knew only by reputation, a world away from your own. You instructed him carefully, your voice low and urgent. Tell them it is a child, a girl of 7, with a high fever of 2 days' duration. Ask if the doctor can come today. John listened, his face pale and serious, absorbing the gravity of the mission. He nodded once and was gone, his footsteps clattering down the stairs. You watched from the window until he disappeared around the corner. The waiting began, a new and more acute form of torture. Every minute stretched. Would the doctor come at all? Would he dismiss the summons from a Prue Street as less pressing than the calls from the broad, tree-lined avenues? Would he come today or tomorrow or never? The uncertainty coiled in the room, a second presence beside the fever. You turned from the window and began to prepare the room. This was a different kind of cleaning. It was not for comfort, but for presentation. You swept the floor with extra vigor, though no dust could cause a fever. You straightened a few possessions on the mantel, hiding the small amber bottle and the packet of licorice root in the cupboard. You did not want the doctor to see your amateur attempts, to judge you for having tried and failed. You smoothed the blankets on Emily's bed, plumping the thin pillow. You opened the window a crack, despite the autumn chill, to let out the close, sick-room air. You were staging a performance of respectable poverty, a home doing its best despite its circumstances. You wanted to be seen as competent, deserving of his full attention. The fear was not just of the illness, but of his judgment. The hours crawled by. John returned breathless with the news that the message had been delivered. The maid had taken it, he said. She said the doctor was out on his rounds, but she would give him the note when he returned. No promise, no time. You thanked him to school, the normalcy of it feeling surreal. Now, there was nothing to do but wait and listen for the sound of carriage wheels, for the firm knock on the door. You sat in your chair, your hands folded, every nerve straining toward the street. The room was painfully tidy, a waiting room. Emily drifted in her fever, unaware of the vigil being kept for the arrival of a stranger who held, you hoped, the key to her deliverance. He came in the late afternoon, just as the light was beginning to fail. The knock was authoritative, too sharp perhaps. Your heart leapt into your throat, and opened the door. There he stood, a figure from another realm. He was not old, but he carried an air of established authority. He wore a dark overcoat and carried a black leather bag, worn at the corners but impressively solid. In his other hand was a polished wooden cane, not for support but for punctuation. His expression was one of busy preoccupation, a man moving from one case to the next. "Good afternoon," he said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. You lead him to the bedside, your mouth dry. He set his bag on the chair you had vacated and removed his coat, which you took numbly. He did not look around the room, his focus was entirely on the small patient. He stood for a moment, looking down at Emily. His gaze was clinical, assessing. Then he opened his bag. The interior was a marvel of order, compartments lined with velvet or leather, holding instruments whose purposes you could only guess. He took out a pair of spectacles and perched them on his nose. The examination began. First his eyes. He leaned close, looking at her face, her throat, her chest. He used his fingers to gently pull down her lower eyelid, peering at the membrane there. He asked her to open her mouth, and with a small, flat piece of wood from his bag he depressed her tongue, studying the white coating you had already noted. He made a soft, non-committal sound in his throat. Next touch. He took her wrist in his hands, his fingers finding the pulse. He pulled a heavy silver watch from his waistcoat pocket and stared at its face while counting silently. His eyebrows drew together slightly. He then placed his hand flat on her abdomen, pressing gently here and there, feeling for things you could not fathom. Emily stirred under the unfamiliar touch but did not wake. Then he took an instrument from his bag, a wooden tube, flared at one end. He placed the flared end against her chest, just above the heart, and leaned his ear against the other end. He listened, moving the tube to a few different places on her chest and back. The room was utterly silent except for the faint crackle of the fire and the ragged sound of her breath. You watched, mesmerized and terrified. This was science, this intimate listening. He was hearing secrets of the body you could not access. After a minute he straightened up, putting the instrument away. He did not use a thermometer. Such things were for hospitals, for experiments, not for a cramped room in the East End. He turned to you. "How long has the fever persisted?" "2 full days, sir, since Tuesday morning." "Any vomiting? Any disturbance of the bowels?" "No, sir." "Has she complained of pain?" "The head, the limbs." She is not lucid enough to say, sir." He nodded, taking off his spectacles and polishing them with a handkerchief. He spoke as he did so, his voice calm and precise. "It is a febrile illness, a fever of uncertain origin. There is some congestion in the lungs, but it is not pronounced. The pulse is rapid, the tongue coated, the humors are agitated." You listened to the words, uncertain origin, agitated humors. They were like Latin, official minus sounding but strangely empty. They described what you already knew. She was hot and sick, but gave it a name that was no name at all. He had not said scarlet fever or typhus or brain fever, or typhus or brain fever. He had given you a category, not a culprit. There was a strange anticlimax to it. You had paid for expertise, and you had received a more educated version of your own fear. He moved to the small table you had cleared for him and opened his bag again, this time removing a small, leather-linus-bound notebook and a pen. He began to write, his hand moving quickly, leaving a trail of elegant, utterly incomprehensible script on the page. The prescription. It was a physical object, a talisman. You saw the Latin abbreviations, the slanted lines, the mysterious symbols. It was the hand of authority, deliberately obscure. He finished with a flourish, tore the page from the book, and handed it to you. "Take this to a reliable chemist. It contains a gentle laxative to clear the system, and a diaphoretic to encourage perspiration. The fever must be allowed to run its course, but we must support the body in expelling the morbid matter." He gave instructions, his tone implying that they were simple common sense. "Ensure the room is well ventilated, but free from draughts. Cool sponging may continue. Nourishment must be light barley water, thin broths. No solid food until the fever fully breaks." He mentioned beef tea, a staple of invalid cookery in wealthy households, as if it were as readily available as water. He did not mention the cost of the medicines he had just prescribed. He was already putting on his coat, gathering his bag and cane. His work he was done. He had observed, classified, and prescribed. The mechanism of healing or failing was now back in your hands, guided by a slip of paper you could not read. You paid him the 2 shillings and 6pence, the coins passing from your hand to his. They disappeared into a leather purse. He offered a few final, general words of encouragement. Children are resilient. The constitution is sound, and then he was gone, the door closing behind him with a solid finality. The room felt different. It was not just a sick room anymore, it was a place that had been officially sanctioned as such by an authority figure. His presence lingered in the scent of his soap, in the impression of his boots on the swept floor, in the cryptic prescription you held in your hand. You looked from the paper to Emily, still burning in her bed. The great expense had been incurred. The professional had come and gone. The diagnosis was a more sophisticated uncertainty. The treatment was a list of instructions that required more resources, more effort, more faith. You folded the prescription carefully, a map written in a language you would never understand, and prepared to embark on the next, more costly leg of the journey. The doctor's visit left behind a residue of expensive inertia. The prescription was filled at a different chemist, costing another shilling and producing 2 small bottles of cloudy liquid. You administered them with a dutiful despair. The laxative did its harsh work, weakening Emily further. The diaphoretic seemed to coax no new sweat from her parched skin. The fever did not break, it intensified. By the 3rd day after the doctor's visit, a new sound entered the room, a low, rasping rattled deep in her chest with each breath. Her eyes, when they opened, saw nothing you could recognize. The space between wakefulness and sleep vanished into a single, troubled continuum. The tidy performance you had staged for the physician had collapsed. The room was a shambles of spent effort, soiled linen in a corner, empty bottles on the mantel. The air thick and stagnant despite the cracked window. You had exhausted your knowledge. You had exhausted your knowledge, your neighbor's wisdom, the chemist's solutions, and the doctor's learned guesses. Only one frontier remained, a place spoken of in hushed, complicated tones, the hospital. The word hung in the air between you and Thomas that evening, unspoken for a long time. He sat by the dying fire, his head in his hands. You stood by Emily's bed, mechanically smoothing her hair. The hospital, it was not a single idea, but a cluster of fears and legends. For people like you, it carried 2 starkly different meanings. It was the last hope, the place where real medical science lived, with its clean wards and trained nurses and surgeons who could perform miracles. And it was the pauper's grave, the dismal endpoint of the poor law, where families were torn apart, where the indigent sick were processed with a cold, institutional efficiency, and from which many never returned. The workhouse infirmary, its shadow was long and cold. To enter its gates was to publicly declare not just illness, but destitution. It was a surrender of dignity, a confession that you could not care for your own. But there was another kind, the voluntary hospital. Founded by charitable subscription, it offered treatment without the taint of the poor law. Yet its doors were not truly open. They required a ticket, a subscriber's recommendation, a token of patronage from a person of means. You knew no such person. Famous foreman might, but to ask was to admit a vulnerability that could cost him his standing. The barrier was invisible but solid as a wall. "She cannot stay like this," Thomas said, his voice muffled by his hands. It was not an argument, just a stark fact. "If we send her to the parish infirmary," you began, unable to finish the sentence. The images flooded your mind. The separation, the uniform, the stories of neglect, of bodies piled in cold rooms. "What choice is there?" he said, looking up, his eyes hollow. "The choice is between a chance there and no chance here." It felt like a betrayal. To send her away was to admit your love and your labor were insufficient. It was to entrust your most precious thing to a system known for its cruelty. The debate was silent, held in the clenched muscles of your jaw, in the despairing slope of Thomas' back. It was decided not by words, but by the terrifying rattle in Emily's chest, a sound that grew more pronounced with every hour. The journey there was a blur of pain and noise. You could not afford a cab. Thomas borrowed a handcart from a neighbor, lining it with a blanket and a thin pillow. You wrapped Emily in every cover you had, her small body lost in the fabric. The morning was raw and damp, As Thomas pulled the cart over the cobblestones, each jolt seemed to shake a gasp from her. You walked beside it, one hand steadying her, the other clutching a small bundle with a spare nightdress. The world outside your street passed by in a smear of grey buildings, grey sky, grey faces of people who glanced once and then looked away, unwilling to witness this private tragedy moving into the public domain. The gate of the infirmary was large and iron, set in a high brick wall. It was not welcoming. A porter emerged from a little lodge. He looked at the cart, at you, at Thomas. His face showed nothing. He asked for your parish, for your name. He made notes in a ledger. This was the first step of a sewer. You were becoming a case. You were directed to a long, low building. The admission room was cold and smelled of carbolic acid, a sharp, clean stench that burned your nostrils and promised a ruthless kind of order. A clerk behind a desk asked more questions. Was the child baptized? Were there any valuables? You handed over the small bundle. It was taken and tagged. You were told visiting hours. Then a nurse appeared, a woman in a stark white apron and cap, her face set in lines of impersonal duty. She gestured for Thomas to lift Emily from the cart. He did, cradling her one last time before passing her to the nurse. The transfer was swift, clinical. Your arms felt instantly, terribly empty. You were allowed to follow, but only to the ward door. The sight that met your eyes would stay with you forever. A vast, long room, endlessly high minus silencing, flooded with a cold light from tall windows. Row upon row of narrow iron beds, each with a hump of blankets, each with a head upon a pillow. Dozens of them. The scale was unimaginable, a field of suffering. The sound was a low, constant murmur, a symphony of coughs, of labored breathing, of occasional low moans, punctuated by the brisk, clicking footsteps of nurses on the polished floor. And the smell, overpowering now, layered over the carbolic, the sour tang of sweat and sickness, the sweet minus putrid note of suppurating wounds, the unmistakable, barnyard smell of concentrated human waste. It was the smell of flesh in distress, stripped of all privacy. The nurse carried Emily down the central aisle, becoming just another small figure in a vast white landscape. She was placed in an empty bed halfway down the row. Grey hospital gown being produced. You were turned away at the door. You could not help her change. You had surrendered all rights to her care. The treatment within those walls was a machine you could not see. You returned during the brief, strictly enforced visiting time the next day. The ward was a different world by daylight, a spectacle of institutionalized healing. A phalanx of doctors swept through, a senior man at the front with a trail of younger men and students behind him. They stopped at each bed, but only for moments. At Emily's bed, the senior doctor listened briefly to her chest with his stethoscope, lifted an eyelid, felt her pulse. He uttered a few technical words to the students, who nodded earnestly. He did not speak to her, nor to you, hovering helplessly at the foot of the bed. The examination was a demonstration, a piece of clinical theatre. The cure, if it came, would be a byproduct of this grand process. The daily care was in the hands of the nurses. They moved like clockwork figures, efficient and unsmiling. They brought round doses of medicine, spooned broth into unresponsive mouths, changed linens with brisk, impersonal motions. Their compassion, if it existed, was buried deep under layers of routine and the sheer, overwhelming volume of need. They were not cruel. They were exhausted. You watched one nurse pause to adjust Emily's pillow, her hands competent, but her eyes already on the next bed. This was care stripped of love, reduced to its mechanical essentials. You heard whispers of new methods, of Lister's antiseptic spray being used in the surgery wards, of the importance of cleanliness. But here, in the fever ward, the battle seemed more primal, a matter of statistics and constitution. The reality of the hospital was not in the drama of surgery, but in the silent, relentless mathematics of illness. It was a place where bodies were assessed for their viability, where treatments were applied according to prevailing theory, and where outcomes were recorded in ledgers. Mortality rates, average durations of stay. Emily was no longer just your daughter, she was a female child, aged 7, admitted with febrile disease of unknown origin, occupying bed, admitted with febrile disease of unknown origin, occupying bed, number 20-7. Her fate would become part of a number, a piece of data used to argue for or against a certain approach. As you sat by her bed during the allotted hour, holding her limp hot hand, you understood the final chilling trade. You had exchanged the intimate, loving terror of home for the impersonal, scientific chance of the institution. You had given her to the machine, and now you could only watch from the outside, hoping its cold gears would somehow, miraculously, spit her back out hot. While the cart carrying Emily rattled towards the infirmary gates, vanishing into that realm of carbolic and cold hope. The landscape of illness stretched far beyond that one East London street. It was a country of its own with different topographies for different sorts of people. In a village 2 days' travel from the city, a man named Samuel knelt in a damp field, the rich earth cool under his knees. He was 40, but hard labor had shaped his body into something older. The pain in his leg was not a feverish mystery, it was a bright, specific agony. A rotten fence post had given way as he leaned into it, and the snap was audible, a dry crack that echoed the breaking of the branch he had been about to toss aside. He did not cry out. He lay in the turned soil, breathing through clenched teeth, his hands going to his left shin where the wrong angle told the whole story. His wife, Agnes, saw him fall from the kitchen garden. She did not run. She walked quickly, her apron already bunched in her hands. By the time she reached him, her mind had already left the house and travelled the 2 miles to the next farm, where old Maggie Lawson lived. Maggie knew bones. She had set her own sons after a ploughshare incident, and she knew the properties of comfrey and willow bark better than any printed manual. Agnes helped Samuel hobble back to their cottage, his weight heavy on her shoulder. There was no discussion of a doctor. The nearest surgeon was in the market town, 2 hours away on horseback if you had one, and his fee was a sum that represented a month's careful saving. The fracture was a clear problem with a traditional solution. They sent their boy to fetch Maggie. The knowledge he was not stored in bottles on a shelf, but in the memory of the land itself. Maggie arrived with a basket. She carried dried comfrey root, nubby and dark, which she grated into a paste with hot water. She had strips of clean, worn linen. She had a pint of small beer for Samuel to drink deeply from before the work began. Her tools were her strong, gnarled hands and a calm, implacable authority. She felt the break through the skin, her fingers tracing the displacement with a gentle, terrifying precision. "Drink more," she told Samuel. Then she pulled. The world went white for him. Agnes held his shoulders. Maggie's hands worked, aligning, coaxing. The comfrey poultice, warm and green minus smelling, was packed around the leg, and the linen strips were wound tight, creating a stiff shell. She fashioned splints from 2 straight pieces of ash wood cut from the hedge. "If will knit," she said, washing her hands in a bowl of water. "I will come back on Sunday." The doctor was a phantom of the town, a figure of last resort for a mortifying wound or a mysterious internal complaint. Here, the community was the first and often the only resort. The isolation was profound. No chemist on the corner, no infirmary down the road, but the network of practical knowledge was deep in generations old. It was a balance. You knew your herbs, Your neighbors held skills passed down like heirlooms. But a sudden fever in the night, or a difficult childbirth carried a sharper edge of peril, with help so very far away. Samuel's leg would heal, crooked perhaps, but functional. The cost was Maggie's kindness and a chicken from their flock to be given in thanks. The account was settled in the old currency of mutual obligation, not in coin. The illness and its remedy were part of the same rural rhythm, intimately connected to soil, season, and the silent understanding that you were, in the end, responsible for your own. In a terraced house in Bloomsbury, a world away from Samuel's Field and further still from the East End, a different kind of sickness held court. Mrs. Arabella Pendleton took her breakfast in her room, a room designated as the sick chamber when required. It was airy, with a floral wallpaper and a grate that held a small, polite fire. She was not hot with fever. She was cold with a pervasive exhaustion, a numbness of spirit that her physician had labeled neurasthenia or nervous depletion. Her malady was one of sensibility, not of contagion. The room was equipped for such things: a carafe of filtered water on the nightstand, an inhaler for medicated vapors on the dresser, a clinical thermometer in its velvet-lined case, a new and fascinating instrument. Her husband had consulted not one, but 2 doctors, the second recommended for his modern views. They spoke of over-axed nerves, of the strains of modern life on a refined constitution. The treatment was a curated performance of convalescence. The chosen doctor's name was mentioned at dinner parties, a signal of both the gravity of her condition and the family's means to seek the best opinion. There was talk of the new germ theory, a fascinating if unsettling idea that invisible creatures might cause disease. It was discussed abstractly over sherry. It did not seem to apply to a weariness of the soul. The prescription was not for laxatives or diaphoretic, but for rest, change of air, and a course of the water cure at a reputable hydropathy establishment in Malvern. Science and solace were blended into a therapy of status. She would travel by train with a maid. The cost was considerable, but it was framed as an investment in her restoration, a necessary retreat. Here, illness was not a brutal invasion to be fought with poultices and grim endurance. It was a disruption of genteel equilibrium, to be managed with specialist advice, appropriate appliances, and a change of scenery. The fear was not of death from fever, but of a permanent diminishment of one's capacity for social and domestic life, a descent into chronic invalidism that would be both a personal tragedy and a social inconvenience. The sick room was not a corner of the kitchen, it was a dedicated, appointed space. The battle was not for survival, but for the return to a prescribed norm of comfortable existence. The resources were vast, but the ailment was oft unnebulous, a shadow that thrived in the very security designed to keep it out. Back in the shadows of the city, in a room not fit to be called a chamber, an old woman named Bessie coughed into the silence. The cough was a part of her, like the ache in her joints, a familiar companion of decades. She lived in a single room at the top of a lodging house in Street Giles, a warren of humanity where smells and sounds leaked through every partition. She had no network, no traditional knowledge to draw upon. Her children were gone, scattered or dead. Her survival was a daily, minute calculation. The cough was worse in the winter, tightening her chest until she saw stars. She knew the streets were a reservoir of disease. She had seen the summer fevers sweep through the crowded courts, and heard the cries from houses where cholera had struck. Her strategy was one of radical avoidance. She avoided doctors, hospitals, chemists, all of them tentacles of a system that demanded things she could not give: money, information, compliance. To enter the poor law infirmary was her ultimate terror. It meant the workhouse. It meant the separation of men and women, the uniform, the loss of her name, the institutional porridge, the burial pit. Better the familiar evil of pain, so she managed. When the cough grew brutal, she would boil a pennyworth of vinegar on her small grate and inhale the sharp steam. She would rub a smear of goose grease, begged from a cook she sometimes charred for, on her chest. She drank weak tea. For the urban destitute like Bessie, the medical map was a wasteland. The parish doctor was a figure of dread, his arrival often a prelude to institutionalization. The hospital required a ticket she could never obtain. The chemist's wares were gaudy lies she could not afford. Her medicine was stoicism, her therapy was invisibility. To be visibly, dangerously ill was to risk the final, unforgiving intervention of the state, so she coughed quietly into her ragged shawl, swallowed the pain, and moved through the crowded streets as if she were whole, a master of disguise in the plainest sight. Her case would never be recorded, her symptoms never diagnosed. Her illness was simply the slow, grinding attrition of a life lived at the very edge, where the only rational treatment was to pretend, for as long as possible, that it did not exist at all. The fever in the end did break. It happened not with a dramatic crisis, but with a slow, grudging retreat. In the infirmary ward on the 5th day, the fierce, dry heat that had emanated from Emily's skin like a banked furnace began to soften. The nurse, during her morning round, noted a dampness on the child's brow. It was the first honest sweat. You were not there to see it. You learned of it hours later, during the brief visiting period, when you touched her forehead and found it cooler, not cold, but merely human -1. Her breathing, though still ragged, had lost the terrible, clicking rattle. Her eyes, when they opened, seemed to see the high ceiling, the white curtains used. They were hollow and confused, but they were present. The machine of the hospital, with its impersonal routines on chemical interventions, had, through some alchemy of timing, physiology, or sheer luck, not consumed her, it had released her. Convalescence was a different country from illness. It was a landscape of profound weakness. The first victory was the day she could sit up against the piled pillows without immediately sinking back exhausted. The world from that new angle was the window at the end of the ward, a rectangle of grey sky. Then came the day she was propped up to sip beef tea herself, her hands trembling around the cup, the broth tasting of nothing and everything. These small actions were monumental. Pale and light as a husk, the journey home in the borrowed cart was a gentler agony. She slept in her own corner, but now it was a true sleep, deep and quiet. You cleaned the room with a frantic energy, airing out the memory of sickness, putting the medicine bottles away in the cupboard as relics of a terrible war. But the battle left its scars on the landscape of home, invisible to the eye but felt in every action. The coins were gone. Worse than gone, there was debt. Thomas had borrowed from the Print Works Club, a shilling here and there, to be repaid from future wages. The small emergency fund was a memory. You had pawned the best blanket in Thomas' second waistcoat. The household economy, always a tightrope, now had a pronounced, unsettling sway. You owed Mrs. Harris not just gratitude, but a tangible return of favor that would take months of small kindness to repay. The social fabric, stretched thin during the crisis, had to be carefully drawn back together. Emily's return was celebrated with quiet relief by the neighbors, but also observed. She was marked now, not by scars but by history. She was the child who had survived the fever, who had gone to the infirmary and returned. It granted the infirmary and returned. It granted her a celebrity, and also a new identity, the delicate one. You saw it in the way women looked at her, a mixture of pity and caution. Managing the weakness was a new full-time labor. The doctor's final, offhand advice had been building foods. This meant eggs when you could get them, a bit of milk set aside from the family's share, the occasional penny spent on a piece of liver for broth. It meant negotiating with Thomas and John for her to have the last piece of bread, claiming it as medicine. It meant defending her right to rest when every instinct of a poor household was to direct all energy towards useful work. You became an advocate for her idleness, a strange and uncomfortable role. You dosed her with a cheap tonic from the chemist, a dark, syrupy liquid that promised to restore vitality, knowing it was mostly treacle and hope, but needing the ritual. Her strength returned in fits and starts, a good morning followed by an afternoon of profound lassitude. Recovery was not a line pointing upward, but a slow spiral path, circling ever closer to a version of her old self, but never quite arriving at the same place. Yet for some, the fever did not retreat, it transformed. It left a permanent resident behind. Imagine if the fever had been the polio, and it had spared her life, but taken the use of her left leg. The limb would lie thin and withered, a stark contrast to the healthy one. The crisis would be over, but a new, lifelong sentence would begin. The family structure would bend around this new reality. Thomas would have to fashion a crude crutch from a sturdy branch. John would take on more of the errands. She could no longer run. You would have to learn to massage the useless limb, to cut and adapt her clothing, to guard against the bedsores that came from immobility. Her future, once a blank page of modest possibilities, would narrow to a single domestic lane. She would not marry, not in a world that saw her as a burden. She would become your permanent charge, a daughter-woman. Or perhaps the fever was typhoid, and it left not a visible crippling, but a deep, sapping weakness in its wake. Her heart would be ticklish, unreliable. She would be prone to sweats and chills, forever cold when others were warm. The management of this chronic state would become a central pillar of daily life. There would be the small, brown bottle of laudanum, not for crisis, but for the dull, grinding ache in her joints, the headache that lingered for days. A draught in a glass of water at bedtime. The line between remedy and reliance would blur season by season by season. You would watch her eyes grow duller, her movements more careful, as the opium-less gentle embrace became a necessary companion. In the street she would be known, with a mixture of kindness and condescension, as that sickly Hopkins girl. The label would define her, a shadow she could never outrun. The illness, in these outcomes, never ended. It simply moved in, rearranged the furniture of a life, and demanded rent in the currency of constant adjustment and diminished dreams. But the fever could have taken the other path. Imagine the rasp in the chest deepening, becoming a fluid gurgle. Imagine the intervals between breaths growing longer, the pauses more profound, until one pause simply did not end. The end, in the infirmary ward, would likely have been witnessed by a nurse, not by you. But if it had happened at home, in the bed by the wall, it would have been a vigil of unbearable intimacy. You would have known, hours before, that the fight was leaving her. The heat would have given way to a clammy, terrible coolness. Her breathing would have become a shallow, mechanical hiccup. You would have held her hand, whispering words that were meant to comfort you both, watching her face for a sign. And then the quiet, a different quiet, an absolute stillness, where before there had been the faint, rusting sound of light. The confirmation was a simple, awful test. Your mother had shown you. You would take the small hand mirror from the mantel, the one you used on Sundays to check your hair. You would hold its cold glass before her lips and nose, and you would watch, your own breath held, for the faintest mist form. None would come. The mirror would remain clear, a window onto a final, empty truth. A world would contract to that polished surface, holding no reflection but your own stunned grief. Then would come the practicalities, stripped of all sentiment. Thomas would have to report the death to the parish. If you had no burial club payment, you faced the parish funeral. This meant the plain, deal coffin, often used and reused, a symbol of ultimate poverty. It meant a swift burial in a crowded churchyard, a shallow grave in a plot shared with strangers, the briefest of rites spoken quickly by a harassed curate. There was no money for a headstone, not even a wooden cross. The earth would simply swallow her, and the location would be forgotten. Mourning for the poor was a private luxury. You might tie a black ribbon around your sleeve if you had one. You might stop the clock for a day, a gesture that felt profound in the sudden silent silence of the room. The neighbors would know. They would bring a pie, a loaf, small offerings that acknowledged the loss and sustained the living. Their kindness would be genuine, but it was also a ritual of community preservation. Relentless and demanding, would press in quickly. The empty corner where her bed had been would scream as silence for a week, a month, a year. But the room was too small for a shrine. Her clothes would be bundled, her few toys put away. The space would be reclaimed, not out of forgetfulness, but out of the sheer, brutal necessity of continuing. The memory of her would become a private, quiet ache, a hollow space you learned to walk around in the crowded rooms of your own heart. In a world that had no time for prolonged, unproductive grief.